The administration is also advocating the development of nuclear-tipped bunker busters to be used against potential al-Qaeda targets. The U.S. is the only nuclear power not to have ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. India and Pakistan have not as well, but that treaty was negotiated before they officially went nuclear. Often, they cite fears of a nuclear-armed Iran in the news most recently, or North Korea, as justification of new weapons. And the United States also continues to deploy nuclear artillery, as well as tactical or battlefield nuclear weapons. Now, lest you think that I'm simply highlighting the United States, other states have actually been fearful of developing these weapons because they believe they'll be considered a pariah if they develop new nuclear weapons. John Ruggie declares that the United States is what he terms the world's leading norms entrepreneur. What the U.S. does, the world follows. Leadership has both its privileges and its responsibilities. And this is just nuclear weaponry. Now let's consider how many people have been killed via conventional weapons. I would probably argue that the AK-47 assault rifle is the real weapon of mass destruction. It's estimated that this weapon kills roughly 250,000 people annually. That is a new Hiroshima and Nagasaki every year. And there's been no attempt to ban or even limit their production of AK-47s or any conventional weapons. And we don't know how many there are out there because they're not all registered, but it's estimated there are 100 million AK-47s in the world today. Our states continue to possess offensive capabilities and continue to provoke fear. And fear is what compels states not to give up the weapons. Now, frustrated at this lack of resolution on the question of the offensive capabilities of weapons, let's turn to the issue of state intentions. Immanuel Kant held out the hope that since democracies don't fight one another, if we just increase the number of democracies, we can increase peace. The question of what we call the zone of democratization, the zone of peace. Actually, empirically, the assertion that democracies do not fight one another is true. Consider, for instance, France and Germany, two states that fought 3 wars in less than 100 years, who now would consider war between the two inconceivable, and democratization helped to promote this kind of peace. Some go so far in my field as to call the democratic peace theory as an axiom, the only one that we have, perhaps except for the balance of power in international relations theory. And it was the foundation of President Clinton's foreign policy. It also is the foundation behind why the United States remains in Iraq and Afghanistan. It holds out the hope that if people are allowed to decide issues of war and peace, should they trust their counterparts in other nations have that same choice, they'd never choose war. They would always choose peace. Now, there are 2 challenges to the democratic peace theory. The first is whether or not you can democratize at the end of a barrel of a gun. Seems kind of oxymoronic to think you can force somebody to be free. It is, of course, the pretext for continued American involvement in Iraq. And setting aside whether or not it's legitimate, the empirical record is pretty shaky. Nations have to want to democratize if they are in fact going to. And I don't have nearly enough time to talk about issues of spoiler violence. I talk about them a lot in my classes and would be happy to answer questions. But in Iraq, while elections are held, the nation is gripped in violence. But even more troubling, I think, is the development of illiberal democracy, or democracies that don't necessarily agree with the United States, as evidenced by the elections in the Gaza Strip and the rise of Hamas, the election of Ahmadinejad in Iran. In each case, the election represents an explicit rejection of alliance with the West. These democratically elected leaders provoke confrontation rather than cooperation. And of course, the United States doesn't respond with anything but confrontation. It raises the interesting issue that Ito Oren raises, which is when we study the democratic peace theory, if we use American descriptions of whether a state is democratic or not, we're actually only measuring whether or not the United States agrees with that state's policy. It simply describes states as democratic if it's an alliance, undemocratic if it's not. Now, consider illiberal democracy. And democracy, as the popular rule of the people, doesn't suggest norms of limited government, liberal values, independent legal system, all those other principles which would mark liberal democracy. Illiberal democracy must be seen as a challenge to that fourth premise, the centrality of states. The great irony of the war on terror, and we'll get to that terminology in just a moment, is that a non-state actor attacked the United States on September the 11th. How did the U.S. respond? By going to war against two states. With the rise of militarized non-state actors, from terror networks like Al-Qaeda to militia leaders who would kidnap and recruit children to wage their wars, to even the rise of publicly traded private military corporations like Blackwater, it's clear we no longer live in a state-centric world. So how do we respond to the lack of a state-centric world? The most popular reaction has been the author Samuel Huntington and the notion of clash of civilizations. Huntington argues that the stakes are raised so that state sovereignty or territory are no longer the currency of conflict, it's civilization itself. Now, sometimes Huntington gets described as a proponent of culture clash, that cultures are clashing. Huntington didn't choose the word culture, he chose the word civilization, because cultures are differentiated, but civilizations are either civilized or uncivilized. Now, instead of fearing for our sovereignty, for our right to govern ourselves, we fear for our civilization. Fear is now fully fused with race, once again creating the combustible mix that leads to such horrible atrocities. The stage is now set for a popular acceptance of policies that oppose core American values. Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, the rendition policy. These aren't done in private. We have candidates running and winning elections because they're practicing these policies. Now, gender scholars have pointed out that this ability to secure a population from a dangerous world, that's what we look for out of a president. Men are expected to serve as the protector in a dangerous world, and the president is the citizen soldier who's there to protect us. This man as protector motif builds fear so into the system that even an opponent to the war in Iraq like Senator John Kerry was required to stare into the camera and declare, "I will hunt down and kill the terrorists," as a way to try to overcome the fear and apprehension of a population convinced that war is the only policy that will protect them. Senator Obama just recently declared that nuclear weapons should never be used, and he was derisively referred to as hopelessly naive and unfit to govern, not by President Bush, but by Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton. My colleague Ann Tickner over at USC, in her book, Gender and International Relations, was wrestling with this question of whether a woman would ever be elected president, since men do the protecting and we expect a citizen soldier. And she came to the sad conclusion that the only way women will build the currency required to govern a country would be if they are fully vested in the protection of the country, women in combat. I've asked her whether or not she could conceive of another way, and she looked at me sadly and said, "Not in the world that we live in." But I hold out hope there's a better way. Fear grips the scholarship in international relations. Practitioners of foreign policy study international relations. They internalize the fear. Think about the moniker of realism, even the description of the term realism. Apparently, I would be surreal, unreal.